The neon sign of Rosie's Diner flickered against the December snow as 36-year-old Christina Hernandez wiped down her last table on that bitter cold night in 2008. In this tight-knit Utah town, Christina was the kind of person who remembered your coffee order and asked about your kids. But when the morning sun rose, Christina was gone. Her sedan sat abandoned on the town's outskirts, keys missing, no signs of struggle. Police suspected foul play, but with no witnesses and limited technology, the investigation stalled. 13 years later, advanced DNA analysis revealed a truth that shattered the community's trust. Before we dive into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from and don't forget to hit subscribe. The amber glow of Rosie's Diner cast long shadows across Main Street as the last flakes of December snow drifted past the frost-covered windows. It was 10:30 p.m. on December 14, 2008, and the small Utah town of Cedar Hollow had already settled into its winter slumber. Inside the diner, Christina Hernandez moved with practiced efficiency, stacking chairs and wiping down the red vinyl booths that had served this community for over 30 years. Christina had dreams bigger than this diner. At 36, she'd been saving every tip, every spare dollar, planning to open her own cafe someday. Her regulars knew about her business plans. She'd sketch ideas on napkins during slow afternoons, her dark eyes lighting up as she described the cozy reading nooks and locally sourced menu she envisioned. Someday soon she'd tell Rosa, her mother, as they sat on the porch swing sharing evening coffee. That night, as Christina locked up the diner, the town was wrapped in an unusual quiet. Even the highway that cut through Cedar Hollow seemed muted by the thick blanket of snow. The streetlights created pools of yellow warmth in the darkness, and Christina's breath formed small clouds as she walked toward her white sedan, the only car remaining in the parking lot. By 11:15 p.m., Rosa Hernandez was pacing her kitchen. Christina always called when she got home from late shifts, a routine they'd maintained since Christina was a teenager. "Misha, I'm safe," was always the first thing Rosa heard, but her phone remained silent. At 11:30, Rosa called the diner. No answer. She tried Christina's cell phone. Straight to voicemail. "Something's wrong," Rosa whispered to herself, her mother's instinct sending alarm bells through her chest. She called Christina's best friend Maria, who lived near the diner. "Can you drive by and see if her car's still there?" 20 minutes later, Maria's panicked voice crackled through Rosa's phone. "Rosa, her car's not at the diner, but I found it parked by Miller's Creek, just sitting there. The engine's cold, doors are locked, but I don't see her anywhere." Detective John Harris received the call at 12:45 a.m. A 20-year veteran of Cedar Hollow's small police force, Harris had handled his share of missing person cases, usually teenagers sneaking out to parties or elderly residents with dementia wandering off. But something about this felt different. Christina wasn't the type to disappear without word, and Miller's Creek was an odd place to abandon a car in the dead of winter. When Harris arrived at the scene, his flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing Christina's sedan parked at an angle near the creek's edge. The driver's door was unlocked, but her purse, phone, and keys were gone. Most troubling was what they didn't find: no footprints leading away from the car, no signs of struggle, no indication of where Christina might have gone. In 30 years of police work, Harris would later say, "I'd never seen anything quite like it. It was as if she'd simply vanished into thin air." The forensics team arrived at dawn, their equipment creating an eerie contrast against the serene winter landscape. They dusted for fingerprints, photographed tire tracks, and searched every inch of the vehicle. The results were puzzling. Christina's fingerprints were exactly where they should be, but there were no other prints, no foreign DNA, no evidence of forced entry or violence. As news of Christina's disappearance spread through Cedar Hollow, the community's shock was palpable. This was a town where people left their doors unlocked, where children walked to school without fear, where the most serious crime in recent memory had been teenagers spray painting the water tower. The idea that someone could simply vanish, possibly taken against their will, shattered the illusion of safety that had defined this place for generations. Rosa stood in her daughter's bedroom that first night, touching the clothes still hanging in the closet, the books stacked on the nightstand, The business plan spread across the desk. "She's coming home," Rosa said to the empty room, her voice barely above a whisper. "She has to come home." But as the hours turned to days, and the snow continued to fall, it became clear that whatever happened to Christina Hernandez on that December night would test this small town's faith, challenge their assumptions about the people they trusted, and ultimately reveal that sometimes the most dangerous predators hide behind the most familiar faces. The morning of December 15th broke gray and bitter across Cedar Hollow, the kind of winter day where the sun seemed more like a rumor than reality. Rosa Hernandez hadn't slept. She'd spent the night calling hospitals, checking with Christina's friends, even driving the back roads herself with a flashlight, calling her daughter's name into the wind. By 7 a.m., Rosie's diner was buzzing with a different kind of energy. Word travels fast in a town of 3,000 people, and by the time the breakfast regulars arrived, everyone knew that Christina Hernandez was missing. The diner felt hollow, without her warm smile and easy conversation, the coffee tasting bitter in cups she should have been filling. Detective Harris assembled his small team in the diner's back booth, the same spot where Christina used to take her breaks. "We need to talk to everyone who was here last night," he told officers Martinez and Stevens. "Every customer, every interaction, anything unusual." Sarah Mitchell, the evening cook, sat across from Harris with trembling hands wrapped around a coffee mug. "Christina seemed normal," she said, her voice barely audible over the diner's morning bustle. "She was talking about Christmas shopping, asking if I thought her mom would like the sweater she'd picked out. The only thing—" Sarah paused, glancing around the diner. "What is it, Sarah?" "There was this one customer, Rick Daniels. He comes in maybe twice a week, always orders the same thing, coffee, black and apple pie. But last night, he stayed until we closed. That's not like him." Harris felt his pulse quicken. Rick Daniels was known around town as a quiet guy who worked maintenance at the elementary school. Divorced, lived alone in a small house near the outskirts of town, kept to himself mostly, but had always been friendly enough. "Did he talk to Christina?" "More than usual," Sarah admitted. "He kept asking her questions about her plans for the holidays, if she was dating anyone. Christina was polite. You know how she is, but I could tell it made her uncomfortable. When we were closing up, he offered to walk her to her car. She said no thanks, but he hung around the parking lot for a while after she left." Within an hour, Harris and Martinez were knocking on Rick Daniels' door. The small ranch house sat on 2 acres of scrubland, isolated from neighbors by a thick grove of pine trees. No one answered their knock. Harris peered through the front window. The house looked lived in but empty. A coffee mug sitting on the kitchen table, yesterday's newspaper spread open. "Check the garage," Harris instructed Martinez. The overhead door was unlocked, revealing an empty space where a vehicle should have been. Oil stains on the concrete showed where a truck had been parked recently. "His neighbors say he drives a blue Ford pickup," Martinez reported after canvassing the area. "Haven't seen him since yesterday evening." By noon, an APB was out for Rick Daniels and his truck. Harris coordinated with state police and surrounding counties, but in 2008, their resources were limited. No GPS tracking, no cell phone location data, no network of traffic cameras to follow a suspect's movements. They were relying on old-fashioned police work and hoping someone would spot the truck. Rosa paced the police station waiting room, her sister Carmen trying to comfort her. "They'll find her, Rosa. You know Christina. She's strong. She's smart. She'll find a way home." But Rosa's mother's intuition was screaming that something terrible had happened. "I should have picked her up from work," she whispered, guilt already beginning to eat at her. "I offered to, but she said she needed the car for errands tomorrow. If I had just gone to get her—" "Stop," Carmen said firmly. "This is not your fault. This is not Christina's fault. This is the fault of whoever took her." The word "took" hung in the air, like a physical presence. No one wanted to say kidnapped or abducted, but the reality was becoming clearer with each passing hour. Good people don't just disappear. Cars don't abandon themselves by creek beds, and men don't flee town the same night a woman goes missing, unless they have something to hide. As afternoon faded to evening, Harris received a call from the state police. Rick Daniels' truck had been spotted at a gas station in Millfield. 60 miles south of Cedar Hollow. The timestamp on the security footage showed 3:17 a.m., just hours after Christina was discovered missing. "He's running," Harris told his team. "Question is, what's he running from? And where is Christina?" The search was expanding beyond Cedar Hollow now, involving multiple agencies and jurisdictions. But for Rosa, sitting in her daughter's empty bedroom as darkness fell, the growing investigation felt both hopeful and terrifying. They had a suspect, which meant Christina's disappearance wasn't random. But it also meant that someone Rosa had seen dozens of times at the diner, someone she'd served coffee to and smiled at, might have taken her daughter. She walked to Christina's window and looked out at the string of houses along their street. Porch lights glowed like beacons, and Rosa realized that in the past 24 hours, her understanding of safety, of community, of trust, had been fundamentally altered. If Rick Daniels could fool an entire town into thinking he was harmless, who else might be hiding behind a friendly facade? That night, Rosa left every light in the house burning, not just the porch light, but every lamp, every overhead fixture, every bulb they had. She wanted Christina to see the house from miles away, wanted her to know that home was waiting, that hope was still alive, that love could pierce even the deepest darkness. Dawn on December 16th brought no comfort to Cedar Hollow. The temperature had dropped to single digits overnight, and Detective Harris couldn't shake the thought that if Christina was somewhere outside, exposure could be as dangerous as whatever had happened to her in the first place. The command center had been set up in the town's community center, a drafty building that usually hosted bingo games and birthday parties. Now it buzzed with activity as state police investigators, search and rescue teams, and FBI agents began coordinating the largest search effort in the county's history. Agent Lisa Crawford from the Salt Lake City FBI field office studied the case file with the methodical precision of someone who'd worked hundreds of missing person cases. "The timeline is tight," she explained to Harris. "Christina leaves the diner at her car is found at Miller's Creek around midnight. That's 90 minutes where anything could have happened." The geographical profile was troubling. Miller's Creek was isolated, surrounded by thousands of acres of wilderness that stretched into the Una Mountains. If someone wanted to hide evidence, or a body, this terrain offered endless possibilities, but it also meant that searching every possible location would take weeks, maybe months. Rosa arrived at the command center, carrying thermoses of coffee and homemade sandwiches. She couldn't just sit at home waiting for news. She needed to do something, to feel useful in the search for her daughter. "Any word on Rick Daniels?" she asked Harris. "We're tracking him," Harris replied, accepting the coffee gratefully. "His truck was spotted again this morning in Price, about 100 miles southeast. We've got units heading there now." But even as they spoke, Harris was beginning to worry that Rick Daniels might be a red herring. Yes, his behavior at the diner had been unusual. And yes, he'd fled town at a suspicious time. But fleeing didn't necessarily mean guilt. It could mean fear, confusion, or just bad timing. And if Rick wasn't their perpetrator, they were losing precious time while Christina's real captor got further away. The search teams deployed across the wilderness used a grid pattern, each team responsible for a specific area. Helicopters with thermal imaging equipment swept overhead, looking for any heat signature that might indicate human presence. Cadaver dogs worked the creek bed and surrounding forest, their handlers watching for any sign that the dogs had caught a scent. Volunteers poured in from surrounding towns. Christina's story had captured regional attention, and hundreds of people who'd never met her felt compelled to help. They handed out flyers, searched abandoned buildings, and checked every barn, shed, and outbuilding in a 50-mile radius. "It's incredible," Maria, Christina's best friend, told a television reporter. "People are driving hours just to help look for someone they've never met. That's the kind of person Christina is. She makes you want to be better, want to do more." But by evening, despite the massive effort, the searches had yielded nothing. No clothing, no personal items, no signs of struggle or violence. It was as if Christina had simply ceased to exist after leaving the diner. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Tommy Fletcher, a 16-year-old who worked part-time at Morrison's gas station on the edge of town, approached Officer Martinez hesitantly. "I saw something weird Saturday night," he said, his voice cracking with nervousness. "I wasn't sure if it was important, but my mom said I should tell someone." Tommy had been working the late shift when Rick Daniels came in around 9 p.m., an hour and a half before Christina disappeared. "He bought gas and a bunch of weird stuff," Tommy recalled. "Duct tape, rope, a tarp, and one of those big plastic storage containers. Paid with cash, which was weird because he usually uses a credit card." Harris felt his blood run cold. Duct tape, rope, and a storage container weren't items someone bought for innocent purposes, especially not at 9 p.m. on a Saturday night. This suggested premeditation, planning, a calculated decision to harm someone. "Did he say anything to you?" Harris asked. "Just asked if we had any bigger containers, like the kind you'd use for storing a lot of stuff." Tommy's voice trailed off as he realized the implications of what he was saying. Agent Crawford ran the timeline in her head. Rick buys suspicious items at 9 p.m. He's at the diner until closing at 10:30, paying unusual attention to Christina. Christina disappears between 10:30 and midnight. Rick's truck is spotted fleeing town at the timeline fit perfectly for someone who had planned an abduction. But it also raised terrifying questions. If Rick had planned this, if he'd bought supplies specifically for kidnapping Christina, what had he done with her? Where was she now? The search intensified, focusing now on areas where someone might dispose of evidence. Abandoned mine shafts, deep ravines, remote cabins, anywhere a person could hide something they never wanted found. But the wilderness was vast, and with each passing hour, the chances of finding Christina alive grew smaller. Rosa sat in the command center as reports came in from search teams, each negative finding feeling like another nail in her hope. But she refused to give up. "She's alive," she told anyone who would listen. "I would know if she wasn't. A mother knows." As night fell on the second day of Christina's disappearance, Harris stared at the map covered in red X marks, areas that had been searched and cleared. The unmarked territory still stretched for miles in every direction. Somewhere in that wilderness, Christina Hernandez was either fighting for her life or already beyond help, and Rick Daniels, the quiet maintenance man who'd fooled an entire town, was still running. The morning of December 17th brought an ice storm to Cedar Hollow, coating everything in a crystalline shell that made the search efforts treacherous and heartbreaking. Rosa stood at the command center window, watching volunteers slip and slide across the parking lot, their determination undiminished by the dangerous conditions. 3 days, she whispered to Carmen, who had barely left her sister's side. "She's been gone 3 days. Inside the community center, the atmosphere had grown more somber. Agent Crawford briefed the assembled searchers with clinical precision, but Harris could see the weight of the case in her eyes. "We've had confirmed sightings of Rick Daniels' vehicle in 3 different towns, all heading generally southeast toward Colorado. State and federal authorities are coordinating roadblocks and surveillance." But even as they spoke, Harris received troubling news. Rick Daniels' truck had been found abandoned in a Walmart parking lot in Grand Junction, Colorado. Security footage showed Rick entering the store at 6:47 a.m. and leaving through a different exit at 7:23 a.m., carrying a large duffel bag. After that, he vanished. "He's switched vehicles," Crawford explained to the team. "Could be stolen, could be borrowed, could be legitimate. We're checking every angle, but he's showing sophisticated planning. This wasn't impulsive." The revelation sent a chill through the room. If Rick Daniels was capable of this level of premeditation, what else had he planned? And more importantly, what had he done with Christina during the long hours before abandoning his truck? Dr. Elizabeth Santos, a behavioral analyst from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, had arrived that morning to develop a psychological profile. She studied crime scene photos and witness statements with the detached focus of someone who'd seen humanity's darkest impulses. "Based on the timeline and evidence," she explained to Harris and Crawford, "we're likely dealing with an organized offender. The purchase of supplies, the patience to wait at the diner, the quick disposal of his vehicle, these suggest someone who's thought this through carefully." "What does that mean for Christina?" Harris asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Organized offenders often keep victims alive longer," Santos said carefully. "They may have specific fantasies they want to fulfill, scenarios they want to play out. The downside is that they're also more likely to successfully conceal their crimes. The words hung in the air like toxic smoke. Everyone understood the implication. Christina might still be alive, but finding her would be exponentially more difficult. Outside, the search continued despite the ice storm. Hundreds of volunteers had organized into disciplined teams, each led by experienced search and rescue personnel. They moved through the wilderness like a methodical army, checking every cave, every abandoned structure, every possible hiding place. Pastor Miguel Reyes from St. Catherine's Catholic Church had established a prayer vigil that ran continuously. "We take shifts," he explained to a television crew. "Someone is always here, always praying, always hoping." Christina's family needs to know they're not alone in this. The vigil had become a focal point for community grief and determination. People who barely knew Christina found themselves unable to sleep, unable to concentrate on their normal lives. Her disappearance had torn a hole in the fabric of their small town, exposing vulnerabilities they'd never considered. "It's like we're all holding our breath," said Janet Morrison, who owned the gas station where Rick had bought his supplies. "We can't exhale until we know what happened to her." The media attention had grown intense. News vans lined Main Street, reporters interviewing anyone willing to talk about Christina, about Rick, about how a trusted community member could harbor such darkness. The attention brought resources and volunteers, but it also brought a circus atmosphere that made Rosa uncomfortable. "They want the story," she told Harris during a quiet moment. "But Christina isn't a story, she's my daughter. She's a person who laughs too loud at movies, and saves stray cats and dreams of opening a cafe where people feel welcome." Harris found himself thinking about Rosa's words as he reviewed the case files that evening. In the clinical language of police reports and evidence logs, it was easy to lose sight of the human being at the center of it all. Christina Hernandez wasn't just a victim or a case number. She was someone's daughter, someone's friend, someone who mattered to a community that was now united in their determination to bring her home. The forensics team had finished processing Rick Daniels' house, finding disturbing evidence of his obsession with Christina. They discovered printed photographs taken covertly at the diner, showing Christina working, laughing, interacting with customers. A journal contained detailed observations about her schedule, her habits, her relationships. Most chilling were the sketches, crude drawings depicting scenarios of captivity and control. This level of surveillance and planning suggests the crime was weeks or months in the making, Crawford told Harris. He wasn't just a regular customer who made an impulsive decision. He was a predator who'd been studying his target. The revelation sent shockwaves through Cedar Hollow. Parents pulled their children closer. People began locking doors they'd never locked before, and everyone looked at their neighbors with new suspicion. If Rick Daniels could hide such darkness behind a friendly facade, who else might be doing the same? But the community also rallied in ways that restored faith in human nature. The local high school organized a fundraiser for the search efforts. Businesses donated food, equipment, and services. Neighboring towns sent volunteers and resources. Social media campaigns spread Christina's photo across multiple states, generating tips and possible sightings. As the fourth day of searching began, Rosa made a decision that would define her approach to this nightmare. She would not hide at home, would not let fear and grief paralyze her. Instead, she would be visible, active, fighting for her daughter with every breath in her body. "Christina is still alive," she announced to the gathered media, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "I know it sounds impossible, but a mother knows. And as long as there's breath in my body, I will never stop looking for her." Weeks turned to months, and the bitter Utah winter seemed to mock the ongoing search efforts. By February 2009, the command center in Cedar Hollow's community center had been scaled back to a single desk, where Detective Harris continued his methodical review of evidence, tips, and dead-end leads. The case had consumed him. His wife, Patricia, watched him grow gaunt and hollow-eyed, bringing work home every night, waking up at 3 a.m. to scribble notes about some new theory or angle he wanted to pursue. "You can't save everyone, John," she told him one evening as he spread crime scene photos across their kitchen table. But you can't help Christina if you destroy yourself trying. But Harris couldn't let go. Something about Christina's disappearance felt personal, perhaps because he'd watched her grow up in this small town, or because Rose's desperate hope reminded him of his own mother's faith when his brother went missing in Vietnam and never came home. The FBI had officially scaled back their involvement, reassigning Agent Crawford to newer cases with better leads. The profile of Rick Daniels as an organized offender had proven accurate. He'd vanished as completely as Christina had, leaving no trace despite a multi-state manhunt. His face appeared on wanted posters from Utah to Texas, but he seemed to have dissolved into the anonymous masses of American drifters and fugitives. Daniels is either dead or very good at staying hidden, Harris told Rosa during one of their regular meetings. These conversations had become a ritual. Rosa would arrive every Tuesday at 2 p.m. with coffee and homemade cookies, and Harris would update her on any developments, no matter how minor. "What about the storage container?" Rosa asked, referring to the plastic container Tommy Fletcher had seen Rick purchase. "You never found it." This detail haunted Harris. In organized crime scenarios, the disposal of evidence was usually careful and deliberate. Rick had bought rope, duct tape, a tarp, and a large storage container. The rope and duct tape suggested restraint. The tarp suggested concealment, but the container suggested something else entirely, preservation perhaps, or transport of something that needed to be kept contained. The search teams had found nothing. No container, no tarp, no trace of Christina or her belongings. It was as if Rick Daniels had prepared for this crime with military precision, leaving no evidence trail for investigators to follow. Dr. Santos, the behavioral analyst, had submitted her final report before returning to Quantico. Her conclusions were both hopeful and terrifying. Subject demonstrates high-level organization and planning capability. Victim survival past initial incident is possible, but likelihood decreases significantly with time. Subject will likely attempt to establish new identity and location far from crime scene. Apprehension probability decreases substantially after first 6 months. 6 months had passed in May. Rosa marked the milestone by organizing the largest search effort since Christina's disappearance, bringing in volunteers from across the region to scour areas that had been searched before. "Maybe we missed something," she told the assembled volunteers. "Maybe there's one place we didn't look carefully enough." But even Rosa's determination couldn't overcome the physical realities of the search. The wilderness around Cedar Hollow covered hundreds of square miles of rugged terrain, caves, abandoned mines, remote cabins, deep ravines. There were thousands of places where evidence could be hidden, and they'd already searched the most obvious locations multiple times. The community's initial unity began to fracture under the strain of prolonged uncertainty. Some people grew tired of the constant media attention, the disruption to their daily lives, the reminder that evil had touched their small town. Others, particularly those who'd known Rick Daniels personally, struggled with guilt and self-doubt. "I sat next to him at church every Sunday for 3 years," confided Eleanor Walsh, an elderly woman who'd befriended Rick after his divorce. "He helped me with my groceries, fixed my fence when it blew down. How could I not have seen what he really was?" This question echoed throughout Cedar Hollow. Rick had been a fixture in the community, not popular or charismatic, but reliable and harmless seeming. He'd worked at the elementary school for 8 years, interacting with children daily. He'd volunteered at community events, attended town meetings, even helped with the annual Christmas tree lighting ceremony. The revelation of his dark obsession with Christina had shattered the community's sense of safety and judgment. If they couldn't recognize a predator who'd lived among them for years, how could they trust anyone? Meanwhile, tips continued to pour in from across the country. Every few weeks, someone would spot a man who looked like Rick Daniels, or find suspicious items in remote locations, or remember seeing something unusual months earlier. Harris followed up on every lead, no matter how unlikely, but none led anywhere meaningful. The most promising lead came in August 2009. A hiker in Colorado discovered a storage container buried in a remote canyon, exactly the type Rick had purchased. Harris drove 6 hours to examine it personally. his heart racing with the possibility that they'd finally found evidence. But the container held only camping supplies, sleeping bags, cooking equipment, water purification tablets. DNA testing confirmed no connection to Christina or Rick. By the first anniversary of Christina's disappearance, the case had grown cold in official terms, though Harris refused to acknowledge it. Rosa organized a memorial service that drew hundreds of people, transforming the community center into a celebration of Christina's life and a testament to the community's enduring hope. "1 year ago, someone took my daughter," Rosa said from the makeshift podium, "but they couldn't take our love for her, our memories of her, or our determination to find the truth. Christina is still out there, and we will not give up." But privately, even Rosa was beginning to struggle with the weight of uncertainty. Carmen found her sister sitting in Christina's bedroom one evening, holding a photo and crying silently. "What if we never know?" Rosa whispered. "What if she's gone and we never find out what happened? How do you live with that kind of uncertainty?" Carmen had no answer. None of them did. The case that had consumed Cedar Hollow for a year had entered that liminal space where hope and despair coexist, where the absence of answers becomes its own kind of presence. Detective Harris continued his investigation, but resources were limited and new cases demanded attention. The file on Christina Hernandez grew thicker with dead ends and false leads, a testament to their thorough failure to solve the mystery that had changed their small town forever. 5 years had passed since Christina Hernandez disappeared, and Cedar Hollow had learned to live with the ghost of her absence. The missing person posters that once covered every storefront window had faded and been replaced by newer community announcements, but Rosa's monthly vigils continued with the persistence of the faithful. Detective Harris had retired in 2012, unable to solve the case that had defined his final years in law enforcement. His replacement, Detective Sarah Chen, inherited a file cabinet filled with evidence, tips and theories that led nowhere. She reviewed the case periodically, hoping fresh eyes might spot something her predecessor had missed. But the fundamental problem remained. Rick Daniels had vanished, as completely as Christina, leaving behind only questions and heartbreak. The town itself had changed. New families moved in, unaware of the tragedy that had once dominated local headlines. Young people who'd been teenagers during the initial search were now adults with children of their own. The elementary school where Rick Daniels had worked was torn down and rebuilt, as if the community needed to erase every trace of his presence. But some changes ran deeper than architecture. Cedar Hollow had lost its innocence, that small-town sense of safety that comes from believing you know everyone around you. Parents were more cautious, more protective. Background checks became standard for anyone working with children. The unlocked doors and trusting assumptions of the past gave way to security systems and careful scrutiny of newcomers. Rosa aged visibly during those years, her dark hair turning silver, lines deepening around her eyes, but her determination never wavered. She converted Christina's bedroom into a kind of shrine, keeping everything exactly as her daughter had left it. Business plans spread across the desk, clothes hanging in the closet, books marked with dog-eared pages. "People think I should move on," Rosa told Carmen during one of their weekly dinners. "They think keeping her room like this is unhealthy. But what if she comes home? What if someone finds her and brings her back? I want everything to be ready for her." Carmen had stopped arguing with her sister's logic years ago. Rosa's hope had become both her salvation and her prison, keeping her connected to Christina while preventing her from fully grieving the loss. The case occasionally resurfaced in regional media, usually around the anniversary of Christina's disappearance, or when similar crimes occurred elsewhere. True crime television shows expressed interest, but Rosa declined all interviews. "They want to sensationalize her story," she explained to Detective Chen. "Christina deserves better than that." But the media attention did generate new tips. In 2011, a woman in Nevada claimed to have seen Rick Daniels working at a construction site outside Las Vegas. By the time authorities investigated, the man had left, and no one could confirm his identity. In 2013, a storage unit in Arizona was found to contain items that might have belonged to Christina: a waitress uniform, a pair of earrings, a small notebook filled with business ideas. DNA testing proved inconclusive, and the item's origin remained a mystery. Each false lead was another small death for Rosa, hope rising and then crashing like waves against an unyielding shore. But she continued to pursue every possibility, no matter how remote, because the alternative, accepting that Christina was gone forever, was unthinkable. Detective Chen approached the case with the systematic thoroughness of her generation, digitizing evidence, entering data into national databases, using computer analysis to identify patterns that earlier investigators might have missed. But even with modern tools, the fundamental problem remained. They were chasing shadows and speculation. The case is solvable, Chen told her lieutenant during a routine review. Daniels left evidence behind, the items he purchased, the surveillance photos, the journal entries, but without the physical evidence from the actual crime, we're missing the crucial pieces that would allow us to prove what happened. The breakthrough they needed would require either finding Rick Daniels himself or discovering where he'd hidden Christina's remains. Both possibilities seemed increasingly unlikely as years passed and Daniels's trail grew colder. In 2014, a new development briefly rekindled hope. The FBI's Cold Case Unit announced a program to re-examine unsolved disappearances using advanced DNA analysis techniques that hadn't been available in cases involving potential serial offenders or organized criminals would receive priority review. Chen submitted Christina's case immediately, but the backlog was enormous. Thousands of families across the country were waiting for similar reviews, and resources were limited. They were told to expect results within 18 to 24 months. Meanwhile, Rosa continued her vigils, her fundraising efforts, her tireless advocacy for missing persons. She'd become a local expert on cold case investigations, corresponding with other families facing similar uncertainties, sharing resources and emotional support. The waiting is the hardest part, she told a support group meeting in Salt Lake City. When someone dies, you grieve and eventually heal. But when someone disappears, you're trapped in this limbo where you can't move forward and you can't go back. Every day, you wake up wondering if today will be the day you finally get answers. The support group included parents, spouses, and siblings of missing persons from across the region. Their stories varied in details, but shared common themes. The initial shock and panic, the intensive search efforts, the gradual realization that their loved one might never be found, and the long struggle to maintain hope while learning to live with uncertainty. Some families had found resolution after years of waiting, remains discovered, perpetrators identified, cases solved through advances in forensic science, or lucky breaks in unrelated investigations. But others had been waiting decades, their missing loved ones becoming part of their identity, their lives organized around the absence they could never fill. Rosa drew strength from these connections, but she also recognized the danger of becoming so consumed by Christina's disappearance that she forgot to live her own life. Carmen worried about her sister's health, her isolation, her tendency to cancel social plans whenever a new lead emerged or an anniversary approached. Christina wouldn't want you to stop living, Carmen said during one of their difficult conversations. She'd want you to be happy, to have joy in your life. I'll be happy when she comes home, Rosa replied, the automatic response she'd given for years. But privately, she was beginning to wonder if happiness would ever be possible again, or if the weight of not knowing would eventually crush the life out of her just as surely as it had taken Christina. As 2015 approached, marking 7 years since Christina's disappearance, Rosa faced a terrible milestone. Most experts agreed that after this length of time, the chances of finding a missing person alive dropped to nearly zero. The search had evolved from a rescue mission to a recovery effort, though Rosa refused to acknowledge the shift. But unknown to everyone in Cedar Hollow, including Rosa herself, technology was advancing in ways that would soon transform cold case investigations. DNA analysis techniques that seemed like science fiction in 2008 were becoming routine tools for forensic scientists. And somewhere in a laboratory in Virginia, a backlogged evidence sample from Christina Hernandez's case was about to reveal secrets that would shatter 13 years of assumptions and change everything this small community thought they knew about trust and the power of never giving up hope. March 15, 2021, began like any other Monday in Cedar Hollow. Rosa was tending to her garden, preparing for spring planting, when her phone rang at 11. Detective Chen's voice was carefully controlled, professional, but Rosa detected something different, an energy, an urgency that hadn't been there in years. "Rosa, I need you to come to the station. We've received some results from the FBI lab that we need to discuss." The drive to the police station felt endless. Rosa's hands trembled on the steering wheel as she tried to prepare herself for whatever news awaited. After 13 years of false leads and dead ends, she'd learned to guard her expectations, but something in Chen's voice suggested this was different. Chen met her at the station entrance, her expression unreadable. "Let's talk in my office," she said, guiding Rosa past the bullpen where other officers pretended not to stare. Everyone in the department knew about Christina's case, knew about Rosa's monthly visits, knew about the vigil that had continued for over a decade. In Chen's office, FBI agent David Park was waiting with a thick manila folder. He introduced himself with the formal courtesy that federal agents seemed to learn in training, but his eyes held a mixture of excitement and apprehension that told Rosa this moment would change everything. "Mrs. Hernandez," Agent Park began, "the advanced DNA analysis we've been conducting on your daughter's case has yielded some significant results, but before I share them, I need you to understand that what we've discovered will likely be shocking." Rosa's heart hammered against her ribs. "Did you find her? Did you find Christina?" "We didn't find Christina herself," Park said carefully, "but we found definitive proof of what happened to her, and more importantly, we've identified her killer." The words seemed to echo in the small office. Rosa felt the world tilt sideways, 13 years of uncertainty suddenly crystallizing into terrible clarity. "Rick Daniels?" Park shook his head. "No, ma'am. Rick Daniels was not responsible for your daughter's disappearance." The revelation hit Rosa like a physical blow. Everything they'd believed, everything they'd assumed, the entire foundation of the investigation had been wrong. Then who? Agent Park opened the manila folder and withdrew a photograph. "The DNA evidence points to Thomas Mitchell. He was—"
No.
Rosa's voice was barely a whisper. "That's impossible. Tommy worked at the gas station. He was the one who told police about Rick buying those supplies. He was 17 years old. 16 at the time of the disappearance," Park corrected gently. "And yes, he was the primary witness against Rick Daniels. What we now know is that Thomas Mitchell orchestrated one of the most sophisticated misdirection campaigns we've ever encountered. He deliberately pointed suspicion toward Daniels to cover his own crime." Chen leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Rosa, we've been working with behavioral analysts and forensic specialists for weeks to understand how this happened. The evidence is conclusive. Tommy Mitchell killed Christina and successfully framed Rick Daniels for the crime." The room spun around Rosa. Tommy Mitchell, the teenager who'd seemed so nervous when he reported Rick's suspicious purchases, who'd been praised for his civic responsibility, who'd attended Christina's memorial services, who'd looked Rosa in the eye and offered his condolences. He'd been 16 years old and had committed murder, then manipulated an entire investigation to protect himself. "The DNA came from evidence we collected from Christina's car," Park explained. "Advanced techniques allowed us to isolate genetic material that was invisible to We found Tommy's DNA on the door handle, the steering wheel, and most significantly, on fibers from Christina's work uniform that were caught in the car's heating system." "But Rick Daniels," Rosa said, struggling to process the information. "His truck, his behavior, the supplies he bought, all innocent," Chen said. "Rick Daniels was having an affair with a married woman in Grand Junction. When he heard about Christina's disappearance and realized he'd be questioned about his whereabouts, he panicked and fled to protect his girlfriend's reputation. The supplies he bought were for a camping trip they'd planned together." Agent Park opened another section of the file. "We found Rick Daniels 6 months ago. He's been living in Oregon under his real name, working as a mechanic, never involved in any criminal activity. When we approached him about the case, he was devastated to learn he'd been considered a suspect. He's been living with guilt for 13 years, believing he could have somehow prevented Christina's disappearance if he hadn't left town. The investigation's failure to find Rick hadn't been due to his criminal sophistication. It had been simple bad luck and the natural tendency of innocent people to avoid law enforcement scrutiny. He'd moved to Oregon, gotten married, started a new life, never realizing that half the country considered him a kidnapper and murderer. Tommy Mitchell is now 29 years old, Park continued. He's been living in Cedar Hollow this entire time, working various jobs, maintaining the facade of a concerned community member. He even participated in some of the anniversary searches for Christina. Rosa felt physically sick. The teenager who'd provided the crucial evidence against Rick Daniels had been Christina's killer all along. He'd attended memorial services, had looked Rosa in the eye and offered sympathy, had lived in the same small town for 13 years, while carrying the secret of what he'd done.
How?
Rosa whispered. How did a 16-year-old plan something so sophisticated? Mitchell was exceptionally intelligent, Park explained. He scored in the 99th percentile on standardized tests, was accepted to several prestigious universities, but chose to stay local. Our behavioral analysts believe he developed an obsession with Christina and carefully planned her abduction over several months. When the opportunity arose to frame Rick Daniels, he took it. The timeline that had seemed so damning for Rick now took on a different meaning. Tommy had been working at the gas station when Rick made his innocent purchases. He'd recognized an opportunity to create a perfect suspect, someone who'd interacted with Christina that night, someone who'd bought items that could be interpreted as sinister, someone whose subsequent behavior would look guilty. The storage container Rick bought was for camping equipment, Chen explained, but Tommy used that detail to create a narrative about disposal of evidence. The rope and duct tape were for securing camping gear, but Tommy knew how they'd be interpreted in the context of a missing person case. Rosa's mind reeled with the implications. Every vigil Tommy had attended, every search he'd participated in, every expression of sympathy he'd offered, had been part of an elaborate performance. He'd watched the community suffer, watched families struggle with uncertainty, watched Rosa age under the weight of not knowing, all while holding the answers everyone desperately sought. "Where is he now?" Rosa asked, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. "In custody," Park replied. "We arrested him this morning at his apartment. He confessed within 2 hours of interrogation. The guilt of carrying this secret for 13 years had taken a significant psychological toll." The confession, Park explained, had been detailed and disturbing. Tommy Mitchell had described an obsession with Christina that began when he was 14 and she was working at the diner. He'd developed elaborate fantasies involving kidnapping and control, had studied her routines and behaviors, had planned the crime with meticulous precision. On the night of December 14, 2008, Tommy had followed Christina from the diner to Miller's Creek, where he'd forced her into his own vehicle at gunpoint. He'd transported her to an abandoned cabin in the mountains, where he'd held her for 3 days before killing her when she attempted to escape. Rosa closed her eyes, finally knowing Christina's fate, but wishing she could unknow it. Her daughter had survived the initial abduction, had fought for her life, had tried to come home. The knowledge was both a relief and a fresh source of agony. "We'll find her remains," Park promised. "Mitchell has agreed to show us the location where he buried her. You'll finally be able to bring Christina home." After 13 years of uncertainty, Rosa would finally have answers. The vigils could end. The searching could stop. The terrible limbo of not knowing was over. But in its place came a different kind of pain, the knowledge of how her daughter had suffered, how the community had been deceived, how justice had been delayed by a teenager's calculated manipulation. As Rosa left the police station that afternoon, she realized that everything about Christina's case would now need to be re-examined, re-understood, reprocessed. The story they'd told themselves about her disappearance had been completely wrong, and the truth was more horrifying than anyone had imagined. The news of Tommy Mitchell's arrest spread through Cedar Hollow like wildfire, but the initial reaction was disbelief rather than relief. For 13 years, the community had organized their understanding of Christina's disappearance around the narrative of Rick Daniels as the perpetrator and Tommy Mitchell as the brave teenager who'd provided crucial evidence. Now, everything they thought they knew had been turned upside down. Detective Chen found herself fielding dozens of calls from community members who simply couldn't accept the new reality. Tommy helped search for Christina, Eleanor Walsh protested during one particularly emotional phone call. He was at every memorial service. How could he do something so horrible and then pretend to care? The answer lay in Tommy Mitchell's confession, which revealed a level of psychological sophistication that disturbed even experienced investigators. Agent Park had conducted hundreds of interrogations, but Tommy's matter-of-fact description of his crimes was particularly chilling. "I was 14 when I first noticed Christina at the diner," Tommy had said, his voice devoid of emotion. "She had this way of making everyone feel special, like she was genuinely interested in what they had to say. I became obsessed with the idea of having that attention focused entirely on me." The confession revealed that Tommy had spent 2 years studying Christina's routines, learning her schedule, identifying moments when she was vulnerable. He'd experimented with different approaches, even staged several accidental encounters, to test how she would react to various scenarios. "I knew I couldn't just approach her romantically," he'd explained to investigators. "She was 20 years older than me, an adult woman with adult relationships, but I thought if I could control the situation completely, if she was dependent on me for survival, she might eventually understand how much I cared about her." The psychological profile that emerged from Tommy's confession painted a picture of a highly intelligent teenager who'd developed sociopathic tendencies at an early age. He'd shown no signs of his violent fantasies to family or friends, maintaining perfect grades and a reputation as a quiet, reliable student. Dr. Santos, the behavioral analyst who'd worked the original case, reviewed Tommy's confession with a mixture of professional fascination and personal horror. "This level of premeditation and emotional manipulation in a 16-year-old is extraordinarily rare," she told the investigative team. "Most adolescent killers act impulsively, but Mitchell demonstrated adult-level planning and calculation." The confession also revealed how Tommy had manipulated the investigation from the very beginning. When Rick Daniels happened to make unusual purchases at the gas station where Tommy worked, Tommy immediately recognized an opportunity to create the perfect suspect. Rick was nervous that night, kept looking around, paid with cash instead of his usual credit card, Tommy had recalled. "I could tell he was doing something he didn't want people to know about." "When Christina disappeared and I heard Rick had been at the diner, I realized I could point suspicion toward him instead of dealing with a random investigation that might eventually focus on me." Tommy's testimony about Rick's purchases had been carefully crafted to sound incriminating. The duct tape, rope and storage container were real, but Tommy had described Rick's demeanor and comments in ways that suggested sinister intent. He'd even practiced his nervous, reluctant witness persona before approaching police. "I made myself seem hesitant to come forward, like I wasn't sure if what I'd seen was important," Tommy explained. "People trust reluctant witnesses more than eager ones. I wanted the police to feel like they had to coax the information out of me." The sophistication of Tommy's manipulation extended beyond the initial witness statement. Over the years, he'd carefully maintained his role as a concerned community member, attending memorial services and participating in search efforts, while secretly monitoring the investigation's progress. "I needed to know what the police were thinking, what evidence they had, whether they were getting close to the truth," he'd said. "By staying involved in the search efforts, I could gather information and make sure I wasn't in danger of being discovered." Perhaps most disturbing was Tommy's description of Christina's final days. He'd held her in an abandoned hunting cabin in the mountains, a location he'd prepared months in advance with supplies and restraints. His fantasy had been that isolation and dependency would eventually break down her resistance and create some twisted form of Stockholm syndrome. "I thought if I kept her safe, fed her, talked to her about her dreams and plans, she might eventually see that I understood her better than anyone else in town," Tommy had explained. "I wasn't trying to hurt her. I was trying to save her from the ordinary life she was living." But Christina had never stopped fighting. Even restrained and isolated, she'd continually looked for opportunities to escape, had refused to engage with Tommy's attempts at conversation, had made it clear that she would never cooperate with his delusions. On the third day, she managed to work loose from the restraints while I was bringing her food. Tommy had said, his voice finally showing some emotion. "She ran toward the door, and I panicked. I grabbed her, and we struggled, and she fell and hit her head on the cabin's stone fireplace. She died almost immediately. The medical examiner who reviewed Tommy's description confirmed that the injury he described would indeed have been fatal. Christina's death had been the result of panicked violence rather than premeditated murder, but the legal distinction meant little to her family and community. Tommy had buried Christina's remains in a remote location several miles from the cabin, using tools he'd cached there months earlier. He'd then methodically destroyed evidence, cleaned the cabin, and returned to his normal life in Cedar Hollow, carrying the secret of what he'd done. "I told myself it was an accident," he'd said. "I told myself I never meant for her to die. But I know that's not really true. I created a situation where violence was inevitable, and I'm responsible for what happened." The confession session had lasted 6 hours, with Tommy providing detailed descriptions of every aspect of the crime. His memory was remarkably precise, suggesting that he'd replayed the events countless times over the 13 intervening years. Agent Park noted that Tommy seemed almost relieved to finally tell someone what had happened. The psychological burden of carrying this secret while maintaining his facade had clearly taken a significant toll, Park reported. He'd become increasingly isolated and depressed in recent years, though he'd hidden these symptoms from family and friends. Tommy's parents, Jim and Susan Mitchell, were devastated by the revelation. They'd raised what they thought was a quiet, intelligent son who'd struggled academically but never shown signs of violence or antisocial behavior. The disconnect between the child they thought they knew and the killer he'd revealed himself to be was incomprehensible. "We keep asking ourselves what we missed," Susan Mitchell told Detective Chen through tears. "Were there signs we should have seen? Could we have prevented this somehow? How do you live with the knowledge that your child is capable of something so horrible?" The community's reaction was complex and painful. Relief at finally having answers was mixed with horror at the truth those answers revealed. People who'd known Tommy for years struggled to reconcile their memories of a quiet teenager with the calculated killer he'd been revealed to be. But perhaps most difficult for many residents was the realization that they'd been living alongside Christina's killer for 13 years, that he'd participated in their morning rituals and search efforts while secretly knowing exactly what had happened to her. As news of Tommy's confession spread beyond Cedar Hollow, the case attracted national attention as an example of how sophisticated manipulation could derail even thorough investigations. Criminologists and behavioral experts studied Tommy's methods, trying to understand how a 16-year-old had successfully fooled experienced investigators and an entire community for over a decade. For Rosa, the confession brought the answers she'd sought for 13 years, but those answers came with a price. Finally knowing Christina's fate meant finally accepting that her daughter was gone, that the vigils and searches and desperate hope had all been based on an impossible dream. The truth had set her free from uncertainty, but it had also destroyed the last vestiges of hope that had sustained her through the darkest years of her life. April 12, 2021 dawned clear and cold in the Utah mountains as Rosa Hernandez followed a convoy of law enforcement vehicles up a winding dirt road that seemed to lead nowhere. Tommy Mitchell sat in the back of a patrol car ahead of her, shackled and flanked by federal agents, finally ready to show them where he had buried her daughter 13 years ago. The location was remote beyond anything Rosa had imagined, 47 miles from Cedar Hollow, accessible only by a series of increasingly rough Forest Service roads that eventually dwindled to nothing more than animal trails. Tommy had chosen the spot with the same meticulous planning that had characterized every aspect of his crime. He must have scouted this area for months. Agent Park explained to Rosa as they hiked the final quarter-mile on foot. The location is far enough from any trail or road that casual hikers would never find it, but accessible enough that he could transport Christina's remains here alone. Rosa forced herself to keep walking, though every step felt like a betrayal of the hope she'd maintained for so long. Part of her had never truly believed this moment would come, the moment when searching would end and grieving could finally begin. Tommy led them to a small clearing surrounded by dense pine trees, a natural amphitheater that felt peaceful despite the horror it concealed. He stood quietly as the forensic team began their work, showing no emotion as they carefully excavated the shallow grave he'd dug 13 years earlier. "I wrapped her in the tarp I'd bought for camping," Tommy said quietly to Agent Park, his voice barely audible over the sound of careful digging. "I wanted her to be protected, I guess. Even though she was gone, I didn't want animals to hurt her." The twisted logic of a killer trying to show respect for his victim was disturbing. But Rosa found herself grateful that Christina's remains had been preserved. After 13 years of not knowing, she would finally be able to hold a funeral, to have a place to visit, to say goodbye properly. The excavation took 4 hours. When the forensic team finally uncovered the tarp Tommy had described, Rosa felt her knees buckle. Detective Chen caught her arm, steadying her as she faced the reality that her daughter's long journey home was almost over. "We'll need time to process everything," the medical examiner explained gently. "But based on preliminary examination, the remains are consistent with Tommy's description of events. We should be able to release Christina to your family within a few weeks." The drive back to Cedar Hollow was silent, except for Rosa's quiet crying. 13 years of uncertainty were ending, but the price of answers was higher than she'd ever imagined. Christina hadn't been living some anonymous life in a distant city, hadn't been held captive somewhere, waiting for rescue. She'd been dead for 13 years, buried in a remote mountain grave by a teenager who'd fooled an entire community. Tommy Mitchell's arraignment was scheduled for the following week. District Attorney Patricia Reynolds had announced that the state would seek first-degree murder charges, despite Tommy's claim that Christina's death had been accidental. "The premeditation involved in this crime is extraordinary," Reynolds explained to reporters gathered outside the courthouse. "Mr. Mitchell spent months planning Christina Hernandez's abduction. He prepared a location to hold her against her will, purchased supplies for restraining her, and carefully orchestrated a scenario to frame an innocent man for his crimes. The fact that he claims her actual death was unintentional does not diminish his legal responsibility for the murder." The legal proceedings attracted intense media attention. True crime podcasters, documentary filmmakers, and journalists from across the country descended on Cedar Hollow, fascinated by the story of a teenage killer who had successfully manipulated an investigation for over a decade. Rosa declined most interview requests, but she did agree to speak with Sandra Lopez, a reporter from the Salt Lake City Tribune, who'd covered Christina's disappearance from the beginning. "People want to understand how Tommy fooled everyone for so long," Rosa told Lopez during their interview. "But I think that's the wrong question. The better question is, how do we create communities where people feel safe enough to report suspicious behavior without fear of being wrong?" Rosa's insight reflected years of painful reflection. She'd realized that Cedar Hollow's small-town mentality, the assumption that they knew everyone and could trust their neighbors, had made them vulnerable to manipulation. Tommy had exploited their trust, their tendency to accept surface appearances, their reluctance to suspect someone they'd known since childhood. If someone had come forward in 2008 and said they thought Tommy Mitchell was acting strangely, we would have dismissed them, Rosa continued. He was 16 years old, a good student, from a nice family. We never would have considered him capable of something like this. The trial was scheduled for fall 2021, but Tommy's defense attorney Marcus Webb approached the prosecution about a possible plea agreement. Tommy was willing to plead guilty to first-degree murder in exchange for life in prison without parole, avoiding the death penalty that prosecutors were considering. "My client recognizes the enormity of what he's done," Webb explained to the media. "He wants to accept responsibility without putting the victim's family through the trauma of a lengthy trial." Rosa surprised many people by supporting the plea agreement. "I have my answers," she told District Attorney Reynolds. "I know what happened to Christina, and I know Tommy will never hurt anyone else. Making him face the death penalty won't bring her back, and a trial would just give him more opportunities to manipulate people." The plea hearing was scheduled for October 15, 2021, just a few weeks before the 13th anniversary of Christina's disappearance. Rosa had planned to attend, to finally look Tommy Mitchell in the eye and tell him how his actions had affected her family and community. But as the date approached, she found herself questioning whether she really wanted to see him again. She'd watched him grow up in Cedar Hollow, had served him coffee at the diner where Christina worked, had accepted his condolences at memorial services. The teenager who'd seemed so concerned, so eager to help, had been her daughter's killer all along. "I don't know if I can look at him without seeing the boy I thought I knew," Rosa confided to Carmen the night before the hearing. "How do you separate the person you believed someone was from the monster they actually are?" Carmen had no answer. None of them did. Tommy Mitchell had revealed the frightening truth that evil could hide behind the most innocent facades, that trust could be weaponized, that communities could be deceived by their own desire to believe in human goodness. The morning of the plea hearing, Rosa made her decision. She would attend, would sit in the front row, would watch as Tommy Mitchell finally accepted legal responsibility for Christina's murder. She owed it to Christina to be there, to bear witness to this moment of justice, however delayed and incomplete it might be. As she dressed that morning, Rosa thought about the porch light she'd kept burning for 13 years. Tonight, for the first time since December 14, 2008, she would turn it off. Christina wasn't coming home. She never had been coming home. But she was finally at peace, and Rosa could begin the long process of learning to live without the hope that had sustained and tormented her for so long. The vigils would end. The searches would stop. The terrible uncertainty would be replaced by terrible certainty. But Rosa would survive, as she'd survived everything else, because Christina's memory deserved to be honored by a mother who chose to live fully, rather than exist in the shadow of unanswered questions. Justice had finally come to Cedar Hollow, brought not by brilliant detective work or lucky breaks, but by advances in forensic science that had made the invisible visible, the hidden known. Tommy Mitchell would spend the rest of his life in prison, and Christina Hernandez would finally rest in peace in the small-town cemetery, where her gravestone would no longer need to say missing, but could simply say, "Beloved daughter gone too soon." On a crisp autumn morning in October 2021, Rosa Hernandez stood in Cedar Hollow Cemetery, beside a freshly carved granite headstone that read Christina Maria Hernandez, 1972-2008, beloved daughter and friend. The inscription was simple, but it represented the end of 13 years of uncertainty and the beginning of a different kind of healing. The funeral had drawn hundreds of people from across the region, some who had known Christina personally, others who had followed her story through the years of searching, and many who simply felt compelled to honor a life cut short by senseless violence. Tommy Mitchell sat in a maximum security prison 2 hours away, beginning a life sentence that would never end. His childhood dreams replaced by the reality of concrete walls and the knowledge that his actions had destroyed multiple lives. Rosa touched the cold granite and thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 13 years of vigils and searches, of hope and despair, of questions that seemed to have no answers. She'd learned that closure wasn't a destination but a process, that healing didn't mean forgetting, and that justice could arrive in unexpected ways after seemingly impossible delays. The Christina Hernandez case had changed Cedar Hollow forever. The small-town innocence that had once defined their community was gone, replaced by a more complex understanding of human nature and the masks that evil could wear. Background checks were now standard for anyone working with children. Parents were more cautious about trusting authority figures. The assumption that we know everyone here had been replaced by the harder wisdom that you can never truly know what lies beneath the surface of another person's life. But the community had also discovered reserves of strength and compassion they hadn't known they possessed. The years of searching had brought neighbors together, created bonds between families who might never have connected otherwise, and demonstrated that love could persist even in the face of unimaginable loss. Rosa had received letters from across the country from other families dealing with missing loved ones, drawing strength from her refusal to give up hope. Detective Chen kept Christina's case file in her desk drawer, not because the investigation was ongoing, but because it reminded her that every missing person represented someone's entire world. The advanced DNA technology that had finally solved Christina's case was being applied to dozens of other cold cases, bringing answers to families who had waited years for the truth. As Rosa walked away from the cemetery that day, she reflected on the lessons her daughter's story might offer to others facing similar nightmares. Technology would continue to advance, forensic techniques would improve, and cases that seemed unsolvable today might yield their secrets tomorrow. But the most important lesson was simpler. Never stop asking questions. Never accept that someone you love is simply gone without explanation. And never underestimate the power of a community united in the search for truth. The porch light that had burned for 13 years was finally dark, but Rosa's determination to honor Christina's memory burned brighter than ever. She'd begun working with other families of missing persons, sharing what she'd learned about navigating investigations, dealing with media attention, and maintaining hope in the face of seemingly impossible odds. Christina's dream of opening a cafe where people felt welcome had been cut short, but Rosa was creating something similar, a space where families dealing with unimaginable loss could find understanding, support, and the strength to continue fighting for answers. The search for Christina Hernandez was over, but her legacy of hope, determination, and community would continue to light the way for others walking through their own dark valleys of uncertainty and loss.